So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Erica Williams. I'm an independent arbitration practitioner at Williams Arbitration. I've been a director of Arbitral Women since 2016, coming up to the end of my 6-year tenure there. I'm on the arbitrator panels of a number of leading institutions, and I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators in Akika, and I'm a graded arbitrator with the Resolution Institute. Today, we are joined by Rika Rangachari, all the way from New York. It's a pleasant 5 p.m. there. Rika has served as the Executive Director of the New York International Arbitration Centre, or NIAC, since 2017. Founded in 2013, NIAC is a not-for-profit, non-governmental organisation that promotes and enhances the conduct of international arbitration in New York. In her role at NIAC, Rika collaborates with stakeholders and thought leaders in the space to advance scholarship and best practice. She offers educational programming, events and training, and operates world-class hearing facilities in Manhattan. This year, Rika helped launch the global initiative Racial Equality for Arbitration Lawyers, or REAL, to build conversation and community on issues of racial and intersectional diversity. Now, if I get the technology right, a link to the REAL website should appear in the chat. Very good. Rika also maintains an active connection to academics as adjunct professor at Seton Hall Law School. In today's discussion, Rika will consider new and emerging norms from an institutional perspective and as a co-founder of REAL. We are also joined by Donna Ross today. Donna is an international commercial lawyer, arbitrator and mediator, and the principal of Donna Ross Dispute Resolution. She is admitted to practice in New York and Australia and holds a French civil law degree. Donna is also a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and a Resolution Institute graded arbitrator. She is a certified mediator and accredited specialist in mediation law. Donna sits on the panels of a number of international and domestic arbitral institutes. In addition to serving as a neutral, Donna advises and acts for clients from civil and common law jurisdiction and teaches arbitration, mediation and negotiation. Today, Donna will address how virtual proceedings can have an impact on diversity in arbitration. And we also have Alex Zhu. Alex is a senior associate in the litigation and dispute resolution team at Clifford Chance in Sydney. She practices across commercial litigation, regulatory investigations, and international commercial arbitration with a focus on energy, resources and infrastructure, TMT and consumer goods, and retail. Alex has been recognised for her work in dispute resolution as a Lawyers Weekly 30 Under 30 award winner. Alex also leads Clifford Chance's pro bono practice in Australia and the Reach Network, which is one of Clifford Chance's diversity affinity networks. Alex is going to address the new and emerging norms being experienced by our young arbitration practitioners. All of our speakers today are members of Arbitral Women. For those of you who attended the International Arbitration Conference yesterday, you will have had the benefit of a discussion revolving around the theme of new and emerging norms in international arbitration. Diversity was touched on by Deborah Tompkinson, Secretary General at Akika, in session 4 of the conference. Tom French, partner at Minter Ellison, touched on diversity in session 7, and Umika Sharma, PhD scholar at the National University of Singapore, discussed diversity in session 8 at the conference. Today, we are going to take a closer look at diversity in the new era in which we now live. Before I put some questions to the panel, I would like to mention the role that Arbitral Women plays in promoting gender equality in arbitration. 60% of participants in the 2018 Queen Mary and White and Case survey recognise that progress has been made for gender equality thanks to Arbitral Women and the Equal Representation in Arbitration Pledge. A link to the website has just popped up in your chat. And I note that you can sign the ERE pledge as an individual or as a firm or organisation, and I encourage you all to do so. Last year, the ICA report on Cross-Institutional Task Force on Gender Diversity in Arbitral Appointments and Proceedings was released. This report noted that the percentage for all of the arbitral institutions considered in the report of female appointments was above 15%, with many institutions being above 20%. For example, the ICC was 21.1%, LCIA 29%, and the SCC 23%. That was for 2019. Closer to home, Deborah Tomkinson stated at the International Arbitration Conference yesterday that there may be a correlation between the introduction of the ERA pledge and female arbitrator statistics in AKICA-administered arbitration. Yesterday, Deborah stated that there were around 20% of female arbitrator appointments in 2019, followed by around 27% in 2020. And the statistics for 2021 are on track to be even higher than in previous years. So AKICA is definitely up there with the institutions promoting arbitral appointments for women. So Arbitral Women's efforts towards diversity in arbitration includes a database of female arbitration practitioners. This database not only lists arbitrators, but also counsel and experts in arbitration. And a link to that database should have just appeared in your chat. You can search on, well, you can apply filters such as country of residence, nationality, legal systems of expertise, and practice areas. However, gender is only one area in which efforts to increase diversity are targeted. To truly increase diversity in arbitration, equal attention needs to be paid to other aspects of diversity, such as ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age, and geography. Arbitral Women acknowledges that we are limited in our ability to support all minorities, and we encourage initiatives to promote other minorities. For example, REAL, as mentioned earlier, focuses on addressing the lack of racial diversity in arbitration. However, I will let Rika speak more on this initiative. And although it is clear that institutions are leading the charge on addressing diversity in arbitrator appointments, institutions can only appoint in certain circumstances, such as when asked to do so by the parties. It is therefore up to those of us making arbitrator nominations on behalf of parties to take diversity not only in terms of gender, but ethnicity, age, and geography into account when making such nominations. Against this background, I'd now like to turn to Rika and ask, Rika, how is diversity and inclusion being addressed in New York and at NIAC?
Thanks so much, Erica. A really warm welcome to everyone. It is such a thrill to be able to beam in for this arbitration week in Australia. Geographically, it may have been more difficult, and so here we go on our virtual platform. So really a pleasure, and to all of the organizers of Australian Arbitration Week. Very interesting question in being able to offer the New York perspective, because I think as we help jurisdictions, this is part of what we wanted to tease out in candor. So as Erica shared, and just by way of background, because sometimes NIAC is misinterpreted as an arbitral institution, we're a non-governing body, like a bar association, privately funded by leading firms in the space that do international arbitration out of New York, often focused on the Americas and specifically Latin America, as well as now buttressed by economist shops and third-party funders. And so that's sort of the makeup and scope of NIAC, and why it has been really interesting to look at sort of NIAC as a platforming, a visibility point of New York and the international arbitration practices, because the lead practices all have joined, thankfully, to support NIAC, support our mission of talking about New York law, the impact of New York as a seat, bar to bench, to ensure that the judiciary is getting it, and that they're certainly seeing a truckload of cases towards enforcement purposes. But what does that all mean? And specifically, what does that all mean in the D&I space? And so it's been really interesting to see how these different firms have needed to diversify, not only their practice groups, but also creating these different internal organizations to try to speak to the myriad definitions of diversity, and have groups where they can get together internally. NIAC, in its leadership, has wanted to try to tease out those internal groups that firms have across the board and speak to them and bring in membership of these diverse individuals working in our space. And so this year in January, we introduced a diversity and inclusion policy that was allied with appointing alternate board members. The idea is that they go in sync. The diversity and inclusion policy signed off by each member of the board of directors then utilizes that policy and thinks about it to appoint an alternate director in their stead when they may not be able to show up sometimes to meetings, but to be an additional voice, a proxy vote, a perspective that gets us to understand our practice better. There is such a beauty in being able to say in our space, we can hop jurisdictions, both in our practice and how we conceive of the world, but we do it out of our global offices. But what does that mean in a practice where there is a necessary hierarchy of learning experience? And how do you showcase the talent, broad scope, from the junior associate to the senior partner, and have dialogues that make sense at every stage of that process? So that's really what we're trying to think about at NIAC. How do you bring in the younger talent to voice their perspectives on programming they want to see? That could be experientially based or could be beyond that. Like, I haven't heard about this and I'd like us to talk about it, whether it's a New York or a US perspective or it's global. And I think this is true for any of our global cities. We all need to be having an international conversation in addition or in parallel to a regional and local conversation to make sure we're tethering and really moving a needle and not just talking in a vacuum about D&I over and over again. And I will tell you, New York, being this sort of city that never sleeps and a global capital of finance, we too have to think deep about what does it mean to have diversity in our leadership? How do we get it? What does parity mean? And so we're constantly talking through these things. It's been really special, I think, in New York specifically, and this is not NIAC related, although many of its members support this. We have some really phenomenal bar association synergy. So lots of conversation happening about D&I and gender, but intersectional diversity as well. But the conundrum often that happens, and what we're trying to figure out is, across the bar associations, each section will have its own diversity committee, at least in New York, because everyone wants to affirm their values and their gusto in D&I. But what does it mean if none of these committees, let's say 30 committees, all creating their own beautiful wheels and they're mapping, what happens if none of them ever talk to one another? And so what we're trying to do as well is say, okay, we understand you have your label and I have my label and he has her label and she has her label, and however you identify and you have your label, but what good will come of it if we can't figure out how we're building inroads and pathways in a cognizable way? So year to year it endures. I just share that to say that's a conversation we're having on the ground now. The bounty of diversity and inclusion committees is phenomenal. What does it mean now towards an accountability standpoint is what I think we really have to ask ourselves if we have the luxury of having so much, but for what good, for what end purpose? And so we're talking about that a lot. What does synergy mean, right? These lovely nebulous terms we get to throw around, but what's the traction? So that's one thing we're thinking about in New York. How do we talk to one another in our own languages to make sure that we get it and we get there, and we have some delta evaluation points? The other thing we have in New York that's just nice to share, and I think a lot of cities have this, but in New York, it's really lovely to see there's this group, the New York Women in International Arbitration. It actually was started by Claudia Solomon, who I know Donna is going to talk about in a moment too, about the ICC and how she's leading the court and charging the court to think about D&I, not only in terms of gender parity, but in general, a robust definition of diversity. But Claudia started this informal group. It's exactly how Arbitral Women started, informally, women gathering to talk in candor about important things. Career mobility, how do you ask for a more robust comp package? How do you have the conversations when you're not getting the work that you want to get, and how do you reposition yourselves? And this may be specific to market. You know, it may be also specific to talk about at times in our careers when we experience market stagnation. How you may do it culturally and maneuver in New York could be different than how you may do it in any other city because of the cultural normativity that exists, right? So how do you do that? And so thanks really to Claudia, but to so many of the women that charge that group, we have this informal get together, and we were meeting during the pandemic at a time when people were really stratified. We were trying to meet once a month to do cocktails on Zoom. It was very difficult to get everyone's tile in one screen, even on the largest of vision boards. But it was a really nice way to say even the most informal of groups meeting regularly can help to talk about important topics and build change in their own way without, having to have a definition of, oh, we improved arbitral appointments. I'll close sort of on this topic by saying too, so one of the things from the ICC Commission report that I really liked is when they're tracking for 2020 nominations and how they're happening of women confirmed or appointed. 42% were nominated by the parties, right? And then 18% nominated by co-arbitrators. I'd like to believe if you create safe spaces where people can come together and they get to know one another in real time, not only who they are on their bios on paper, on their firm profile, on their arbitrator profile, but they meet in person, which they often have done at NIAC, but not in pandemic. Appointments have come out of that grassroots sort of just getting together. And that's been really lovely and frankly, really difficult in pandemic where we weren't gathering because it wasn't safe, right? As a hearing center, nobody wanted to gather people together and not know what the outcome would be. And so I'm really excited to go back to a time, not only where we say things like hybrid and use it casually, but go back to in person because those engagements are really special and I think go towards these really robust statistics that the ICC has offered about how women get appointed to cases, but how diverse people by and large get appointed to cases. It is often through this network we build, in addition to or in parallel to what's on the paper and our credentialing, right? And so that's just really interesting to see from a New York snapshot.
Thank you very much, Rika. And you've touched on so many things that we are all experiencing, especially in the last 2 years, such as virtual cocktails. And I know Alex is going to mention some of the opportunities young practitioners have had to connect in this virtual world, which may not have been opportunities when we didn't think that a Zoom call was a normal thing to do. And so you also mentioned there's a broad number of D&I committees. And one of them obviously is REAL. So I wanted to ask you, what was the impetus for REAL and why now and for what purpose? And do you think it fills a gap in the diversity landscape?
Yeah, thank you so much. So let me just back up for a moment and sort of share when the juncture is real was introduced and sort of how many conversations happened before it even came to fruition. So as many of you may know, race relations in the context of police engagement and police contact was a hot button issue, 2020 into present. But there was a lot happening in 2020 in the United States. And so a small group of us started a conversation globally about, well, it's really interesting. A lot of these conversations are anchored in race. And even within our international arbitration space on the interwebs, when race comes up, it's a really thorny issue. People feel they have to pick a side or it has to be a difficult conversation. And even in moments on some of these conversations, folks have to be reminded of civility, talk to one another with civility. Yet we meet as advocates on opposite side of the line frequently, right, on cases. And yet when it comes to some topics, it's hard for people to not demonstrate their humanity in such a vocalized and defensive, even sometimes, way. And we kept thinking, well, why is this? Why can't we talk about race more often? What does race mean? Broadly defined, more specifically defined, is race a changing conversation depending on where you're based and even your ability to talk about race? Right. And so in the context of what was happening in the US, we said we need to figure out a way to talk about diversity and intersectional diversity beyond gender, which groups like Arbitral Women and the ERA Pledge, which Erica mentioned, they have buttressed these conversations and made great change. what about all the other definitions of that diversity? And so we started to focus in on race in particular. We launched in January 2021 on Martin Luther King Day, trying to pick temporally a day that resonated with many, to launch and to listen to some stories from the global community, both in public and private international law, on the impact their race had on their career trajectory. And it was really just really beautiful stories were shared, just to buttress the point of race can be an inflection point that may hurt your career if you can't get past it and can't socialize it, figure out what the boundaries are, learn how to talk about it. How do you talk about it? Will you be maligned if you talk about it? In many ways, we borrow at Real from Arbitral Women in the ERA Pledge and this notion of grassroots organizing, getting together in small groups to become a community, to be able to talk about things in candor and share experiences. And from there, to build out. Two of the words that we talk about a lot at Real are access and advocacy. But what do those mean, right? In a silo, we have to define them. Access at Real means scholarship. So since Real launched in January, we have offered more than 50 scholarships to myriad programs that run the gamut of chartered institute fellowship programs where the cost of entry could be really weighty, to GAR events, to other events where our partners, it was always pay to play and they give us seats. So it's this notion of really collaborating in real time and asking, for lack of a better way to say it, hey, for example, if somebody came to me and said, hey, can NIAC non-financially support this event? Sure. Hey, on the side, can I ask you, because it's pay to play, would you offer a few scholarship seats to Real under criteria you either might provide or we would provide, because we always want people applying and sharing their stories and telling us about why they want to go to this kind of event. So it's really a meaningful return on investment or return on scholarship. So that's really sort of what we've been up to. And I'm really excited. It's still really nascent, right? It just started this year. But there are so many palpable conversations happening already. One of my favorites that was shared recently, two women were able to connect, and they connected under the Real banner at the same firm in different offices. So it just goes to show they could have easily connected on their own, global law firm, right? There are lots of ways, but they used Real as the anchor to start a conversation. And that means that it is opening doors to some conversations. To me, at this stage, those are examples of progress. Even if they're finite, they're still examples, right? And that's how you build forward, not with magnanimous, huge jumps and leaps that may not endure, but the small ones that hopefully over time we just keep moving forward with, to figure out how we map all of this. And then, really I need to herald the leadership. So at Real, we have a series of different leaderships. There's a steering committee of some 20 leaders from across the world, different jurisdictions with different language capacities, so that we can really touch on the crux of some of the issues we're going to have to dialogue on. And then we have our leadership from our chairs and our vice chairs and the committees that are really going to push forward the work. One of those committees to share with you is also one that's going to think about critical race theory. It's an academic council that's going to publish articles, because in order to have conversations about this, sometimes you have to start at baseline with what is the nomenclature. So we're all allied on some level with that dictionary to have a conversation and increase engagement. And then we have our ambassadors. And finally, last but not least, our Real partners. These are our institutional and organizational partners that really want to support. And they, the ones who are really thinking about this, keep saying, what is it we can do together? It's not always an easy answer, but it's certainly a question that ricochets, I think, in all of the leadership's minds. What can we do to make sure we're forward more steps than we go back? But with that, I hope you may consider learning more about Real if it is of interest, or Arbitral Women or the ERA Pledge. All of these are entry points, and the goal really is we all get together and have conversations together as well, because if we're building properly, we're doing it in some symbiosis.
Thanks so much, Rika. I think the crux of the story is we're building communities, and I love that through the creation of Real, two people in the same law firm were able to connect when they might not have previously. That's just one example. And I actually even saw someone on my LinkedIn today who was thanking Real because they were awarded a scholarship to attend some of the Hong Kong Arbitration Week events. So you're definitely making an impact, and it's a great initiative. So I'm going to turn to Donna now, who, I mean, yes, we can't meet in person at the moment, and that makes things challenging. But I think the virtual world and the use of technology might be able to benefit women and perhaps give women an edge. Donna, did you want to talk on this?
Yes, thank you, Erica. And I want to thank Arbitral Women, of which I'm also a board member and I think has been doing fantastic work, and also the Chartered Institute Nikika, because this whole week has been, for the second year in a row now, gone virtual, which I think is proof of the fact that we are living in a virtual world, and having all these women online here shows that technology is something that we can deal with. I think just before I start, it's important to say that, you know, virtual or at least hybrid hearings are really here to stay. So it's not just that, you know, can women get an edge for a year and then it's back to people flying all over the place. If we look at what Lucy Greenwood has started with the Campaign for Greener Arbitrations, there's an increasing awareness of climate change, of reducing our carbon footprint, which will help to support, I think, the use of virtual platforms, maybe not exclusively, but definitely to a certain extent going forward in the future. So if this can give women an edge, then hopefully it will be an edge also going forward. And I wanted to thank Rika, because being from New York originally and now Melbourne via Paris and New York, it's a really very nostalgic to hear about what New York is doing. And I think that maybe Australia could follow suit, and we should work on that, on some of the examples that Rika has just given. I think that it's really if we look at women in general, and not just younger women, but younger women are important because of the fact that if we look at the law firms and we look at rising arbitrators, we can see that even though at the partner level and at the arbitrator appointment level, we're still far behind, the younger generation coming up is predominantly female. So that means that they're going to be used to working online, working alone, not just the younger ones, but women in general, and men now, and that they're going to probably be more tech savvy. Now, it's not just the younger ones that are more tech savvy, but if we look at what the pandemic has brought, and perhaps even pre-pandemic, a lot of women have to be versed in social media because they're the main caregivers of their children who are on social media constantly. They've been homeschooling, so they have had to deal with technology, like it or not, due to the pandemic, which we know that the majority of the caregivers, I'm not saying that no men are doing this or homeschooling, are women, which is going to give them an edge in technology. If we look at, and we've talked about the pale male and stale, but if we look at the arbitration community made up of more men who are perhaps less ethnically diverse and certainly less gender diverse, they are not necessarily used to doing that. I remember way back in New York, the ICC, pre-Sakana, set up a group for sole practitioner arbitrators who'd come from firms, and some of them didn't know how to turn on their computers. Now, I know that that has changed since, but they're used to having assistants. They're used to having somebody doing it for them. And we've seen what happened with the video that went viral with one lawyer who had an assistant who put a cat on as the virtual background and had to go find the assistant to take the cat off the computer. Okay, that was a joke and we all needed that levity, but seriously, I think that women adapt better. We're used to adapting. We're used to, I don't have children, but you know, we're used to having children, dealing with all of that and dealing with work. We can juggle these different things, I think, better than men. And I think men rely more on assistants to do so. So that, I think, will give women an edge going forward. And everyone is speaking about the fact that, arbitration is no longer as cost effective. We'll be talking about some of the delays. Maybe a change is what's necessary. Get new people in, people who can do things differently and not just follow the same old. And that's something really important. I think women are often more flexible and adaptable, as I've just said, and this can help to improve the process. If we look at the arbitrators who are going out on their own, and I don't have any statistics on this, I think that most of the women, and I'm here, Erica's here, I mentioned Lucy Greenwood, and in many countries around the world, we can see that women are the ones who are going out on their own. They're setting up their arbitration practices, and I see this in France too, more so than men. Men tend to need that structure. Perhaps we need it too, but we're more flexible about going out and doing things on our own. I mentioned some of the time and delay requirements. Since women are more available, because in the best case scenario, we're only getting a bit over 20% of the appointments, that means that we won't have a schedule that's so full, which will either preclude us from taking on appointments or bring down our fees at the end, because the KICA has now followed on the ICC with certain rules about availability and timing for awards. So that's also something that's very important. And I think that goes hand in hand with the parties' increasing concern for costs. There are going to be more and more disputes due to the pandemic. We'll be speaking later in the week about frustration, force majeure. Parties don't have the same budget that they did in the past to fly, 3 arbitrators at $1,000 an hour around the world. And that's where we might be able to find another niche. I mentioned more adaptability, but I think women think on their feet more, and sometimes they're better listeners. Now, I'm not saying that men aren't, and there are many men who are, but it's something that we're used to because we have to do it. When my husband writes books on Oracle, but when it comes to minor computer things, I'm the one who has to, come in often and think, how do we do this, other than just the that tech version. And that's what's required. When you're on a platform and you're dealing with multiple parties and someone has an issue, how do you just jump in and help solve it? Now, yes, you'll have in large arbitrations in particular, your whole technical team, but it's that ability to deal with things as they come that I think women are better at than men, who often just call, as I said, their assistant to come in and help. And again, that's probably a generalization, but one that I think does hold some weight. I think that women have an opportunity to improve the process, as I mentioned earlier, by being more strict on those procedures, and that is so much easier on virtual platforms. We've spoken this week and in the past about the fact that, female judges or arbitrators get interrupted much more by men than male judges or arbitrators. But we have an opportunity with a virtual platform to stop that by setting the rules about muting people, about you can't speak over each other because of the lag on Zoom. So we can use these nice ways of preventing this. And I've done it in the last hearing I had. Some of us were present. It was I'm on hybrid, but in some of the procedural conferences, I noticed one barrister in particular who would keep speaking over me, and I stopped it in that way. So those are a number of things that I think can help us to make inroads and use this technology, use these virtual platforms to increase our appointments as women, along with a number of other factors that I think we'll be discussing as we go along.
Thank you, Donna. So you've discussed the context of virtual hearings and the ability to hopefully for women to get an edge. And I think you and I have demonstrated the need to become your own IT team by miraculously creating our own backgrounds. I was impressed with myself. And, we're here in Arbitration Week. Another thing that's very evident on this call, especially the 4 of us speakers, none of us are in the same city as the other. So do you think the virtual world is providing opportunities for female practitioners to be more visible in general, not just in the terms of arbitrator appointments?
Yes, absolutely. And I'd just like to say on the virtual backgrounds, I did have a little bit of help from my husband, threw it together last night, but he couldn't get it going. And with Alexandra, so talk about young women, and Eric, I think that was before you came on, Rika, we figured out the mirror effect, and in just a few minutes got mine up. I usually use my office background, but I've just moved offices and I've got empty shelves behind me. And I tend to sometimes avoid virtual backgrounds in mediations or arbitrations because you can't really see what's going on in the background. So for confidentiality reasons, but not speaking. Are they more visible? Absolutely, absolutely. I think that there are so many conferences and so many speaking opportunities in so many different regions. I mean, look now, we've got Rika from New York. If we look at the conference yesterday, 45% of the speakers were women. Now, speaking isn't enough, but as Rika said, and she didn't use this word, it's baby steps. That's the first step, or maybe several steps along towards visibility. And arbitration practitioners are more visible, and even women who are seeking to get appointments are definitely more visible. Rika has spoken about scholarships. The virtual world has brought us so many free events. It used to cost not just the travel and lodging costs, but we used to have to spend what, $700-800 to attend a GAR conference or the yesterday's Akika CIR conference during arbitration week. So many more of these events are free, and so people can attend them from throughout the world. And this is really important, reaching different geographic regions without any expenses. That's really important, except for perhaps some lack of sleep if you're doing it from the other side of the world. But the younger generation is probably better at that. I think I've reached my quota of having done that all my life. I think that there's maybe some pointers that would be helpful in making female arbitration practitioners more visible, and that's not being afraid to speak out. As women, and we've read about this in interviews, men will just go in and say, yeah, I've done this, I've done that. They'll ask questions, not even thinking for a moment, oh, is that a silly question? Is it accurate? Am I right? We don't. We hesitate. And I remember once I was in New York at an arbitration conference with a lot of arbitration practitioners, and I was sitting at a table with 5 men, of course, and associates, not necessarily seasoned. And I thought of this question. I thought it was a great question. I said, oh no, what if it's not? And 2 minutes later, the guy next to me asks the same question, and everyone said, oh, what a fantastic question. And I wanted to kick myself. We do that all the time, and I see smiles. We hesitate. You know what? No matter what we do, it's, the garden party song, you can't please everyone, but people will know you. Some people will look and say, oh, don't like her, but others will look and say, that's a smart question, and they'll remember you. They won't remember you if you're just there as a wallflower. They'll just remember everyone at the table who spoke out. We need to speak out more, and I believe that the visibility through all of these events is giving us that opportunity. And that recognition and respect of knowledge will eventually lead to appointments. Also being front of mind, and this is something I think we all have trouble with, juggling so many things, is that that's not enough. We need to follow up on that visibility. And I'm probably the first one who's guilty of not doing that enough. This also ties in with something that I heard the other day, and I think we all know that former judges, QCs, and I'm sorry, I see Richard Manley here, I'm certainly not referring to you, don't always make the best arbitrators. What's most important is the skill set. So by being visible, by speaking, by asking those questions to show that we have knowledge, we will show what our skill set is. And yesterday we had a woman on one of the panels talking about space disputes. Okay, I'm not saying that you have to become an expert in space disputes, but especially for younger practitioners, you can find some kind of a niche, something that you can show that you're an expert in, and that's really, really important. Another thing I think we have to do for the visibility is to very, very nicely call out men when they are in their old boys club mode. I chaired for a number of years the Victorian Arbitration Committee of Resolution Institute, and we would run a master class. And both master classes, which are 2 years apart, had 18 to 20 participants, and I don't need to ask anyone who was the only female there. And even really a very nice, barrister whom I know, who was chairing one of them, spoke out and said, "Oh, so gentlemen," and before I could speak, actually another arbitrator, mediator, ADR practitioner kind of nudged him and said, "Excuse me," because it was just, it didn't cross his mind that he wasn't speaking just to his fellow barristers. So at the end, I turned around when I was closing the meeting and I said, well, thank you very much. And I guess now I can say gentlemen. It puts you out there. It shows you, and it's a nice way of reminding them that if there are one or two women in the room, so don't be afraid. Don't just sit there and say, oh, I wasn't recognized. I'm there. And I've been there so many times, particularly in Melbourne. I know, Rika, you've talked about New York. I think that we have work to do in Australia. I speak of Melbourne because I know that better. I think the visibility also comes from the institutions. Rika, you mentioned Claudia Salomon, who is now the president of the ICC, but Alexei Moore, he was such a strong supporter of women also, even beforehand. And Claudia, though, now has really sent a message. She is dedicated to diversity and inclusion, not just gender, but disability, racial, and all others. And we can see that more than half of the members of the court now are women. They're the majority. I mean, who would have thought that that could happen? I remember working with the ICC years ago where, you never had a tribunal that wasn't made up of, white men from Sweden, France, Switzerland, who are all at least over 60, 65. So things are changing, but it's slow. And I think we really need to try to harness that. Arbitral women, and you mentioned that Claudia was the one who was behind some of the initiatives in New York, but it was Louise Barrington and Mirez Philippe who set up Arbitral Women over 25 years ago, when no one thought that it would go anywhere, and look what has been achieved. So that's really very important. But I think that we need to go beyond the institutions, because yes, the institutions do appoint, but even with appointments, the parties still get to choose amongst the candidates put forward. And 9 times out of 10, it's not the female candidate, even with equal skill sets. So that's something that we need to do. We need to get all stakeholders on board. So even though institutions are leading the way, I think that councils and parties are the ones making the decisions, and those are the ones that we need to go to. Arbitral Women has a champion for change. We're not the only ones. We need to get men to speak out. I think they're really going to be the engine for change. Women are at the heads of institutions, but we need to get more women on the panels. And that's something that we need to really break those preconceived notions that men make better arbitrators. Do they in some cases? Perhaps. Do they in all cases? No, because women are just as smart and perhaps a bit more tech savvy than men. So I have a little bit of a politically incorrect idea to throw out there that might not be taken on board. But we've heard about in interviews where candidates put in CVs, their curriculum vitae, with no gender, no age, no photos. Well, maybe we could do that for arbitration panels too.
That's a very good point, Donna. And we've seen the results of those sorts of experiments. And one thing I wanted to say about having diverse speakers on panels, an initiative that Arbitral Women has done is, and actually it was on LinkedIn just today, a little article on diversity being equally important for virtual events. And I have actually started, if I see an event advertised on LinkedIn that's an all-male panel, I'll just link to the article that is on, diversity is equally important in virtual events. And one of the institutions that was running an all-male panel actually commented back and said, thank you, we'll take this on board. So hopefully they weren't offended. I just wanted to, I'm sure in the Asia Pacific region, there is a woman who could speak on the topic. And Alex is one of the practitioners who's hopefully going to reap the benefits of all the work that's been happening. And I know Alex has been working in the virtual world, as all of us, for the last 2 years. And I wanted to get some insights on what you think the younger practitioners are experiencing, and what sort of upskilling and development opportunities have there been?
Thanks, Erica, and thank you to Arbitral Women for having me this morning as well. I mean, upskilling and development opportunities have definitely increased. One of the silver linings of the new normal we find ourselves in has been that somewhat forced acceptance of virtual hearings, which Donna has already touched on. I mean, I think it's uncontroversial now to say that physical hearings are just not needed for reasonably straightforward disputes, maybe with 2 or 3 parties with limited witnesses, or for things like procedural conferences. And one of the great development opportunities that comes from that is the access that younger practitioners now have, because frankly, younger practitioners can sometimes be left behind in the office when it comes to confirming resources for an overseas or an interstate hearing. And it's difficult to learn the tips and tricks of oral advocacy if you're stuck reading the written transcript only. Now, because of the virtual nature, the opportunities that we now have to get involved in arise because we can be there in real time now. I mean, subject to the terms of your virtual hearing protocol, I mean, there are many a story of boardrooms getting converted into effectively a hearing room with space for an audience. So trainees, paralegals, solicitors, junior associates can pop in and watch a live cross-examination. I've also personally experienced benefits of a virtual hearing, and I know my peers have as well, because we've really been able to hone in on our advocacy skills through, for example, examining opposing parties' witnesses. And the benefit of cross-examining your witness in a virtual hearing context rather than a physical hearing is that joy of the mute button. Because if a witness isn't giving you the evidence you need or is being evasive, I have actually just muted myself and checked in with my partner to make sure if my line of questioning is appropriate, and I can receive real-time mentoring that I wouldn't be able to get in a physical hearing without looking like I'm actually getting assistance. And if we're running short on time as well, I can also easily confer with my team about what questioning topics should be prioritized and moved around. And that's the best on-time and real-time development you can get. I think procedural conferences themselves also lend to being a somewhat kinder introduction into oral advocacy, because these are often conducted by a telephone link, and I think probably will for the foreseeable future. And so possibly less nerve-wracking if you're starting out with your oral submissions. I would also encourage younger practitioners, if you don't already, to make the most of any opportunity where you are presenting submissions or examining witnesses in a virtual context by actually obtaining access to the video or audio recording of the hearing. Again, this needs to be subject to your virtual hearing protocol and any procedural orders, but if it is permitted, that's a really invaluable tool that can allow you to reflect on what was good about your performance and what could be improved in the next matter. I know particularly with the teams that I work with, we'll often debrief after the end of a matter, and it's also really insightful for you to understand what you've done well, and you actually have a live recording of how you actually perform, which I think is fantastic. To make a very broad generalization that Don has also touched on, younger practitioners tend to be a bit more tech savvy than the senior practitioners, and there's value in understanding, for example, like how a hearing suite works, because it frankly makes you more useful, and younger practitioners being more useful tend to mean that you will likely have a more active role in a hearing and likely be able to participate a bit more. I would also like to think, naive as it may be, that the setup of virtual hearings can also subconsciously improve perceptions around gender diversity and parity. I mean, I don't think it's uncontroversial as well to say that at a physical hearing, you can also often have the men in first chair position and the women are situated at the back of the room. And I've seen that time and time again in every single context. And it really drives me up the wall. But until we can make real strides in achieving gender representation at tribunal and council level and at instructor level, I think there's a real subconscious benefit in having all speakers on an equal like Zoom footing, because you're not, I suppose, accustomed to seeing all the men sitting first chair, because now everyone is on an hopefully level playing field, and hopefully that changes the perceptions around as well what's considered normal in terms of representation. I am conscious of the time, but before I hand back to Erica, I mean, even in a litigation context, most, if not all, courts stream their hearings via a telephone or video link unless there are confidentiality orders. And I'm really conscious that if there are younger practitioners there who haven't been able to experience as much in an arbitration practice area yet, I would really encourage you to take advantage of everything else the virtual world has to offer. I mean, practically, this means if you want to learn a bit more about what good advocacy looks like, or perhaps more usefully from what I've learned from bad advocacy looks like, actually joining a directions hearing, or even something as simple as a return of subpoena via telephone link, means you can learn what the practical process is, and you can get insight into what oral advocacy should be. And hopefully that's a bit of a development opportunity that you can have if you don't have that access to a virtual arbitration hearing yet.
Yeah, Alex, I think you really touched on some amazing points, and I myself have been involved in an arbitration hearing where, yes, one of our meeting rooms was converted for people to go and have a look at what happens in a hearing. And I've also dialed into federal court proceedings because I'm a nerd and I thought it was interesting. So you've touched on the very substantive type of upskilling and opportunities that young practitioners have. But what about the more casual, connective community opportunities that have become available?
Yeah, I think the ability for younger practitioners to learn more about this industry, including by being able to connect with your colleagues and peers through the new virtual initiatives, has been like fantastic. I mean, it's second nature now for us to join a video conference with someone with our camera on, even if they're on the other side of the globe. And I think reaching out to speakers after a webinar or a training session is a lot, I suppose, easier to do, and it might be less off-putting than if you were trying to do it after a in-person webinar. I think because we've also been in each other's homes through Zoom or Teams for so long, people are really liaising and connecting in a more personal way. And I think this is something that younger practitioners should really capitalize on. I mean, there are a whole host of new or relatively new virtual initiatives that are really targeted towards younger practitioners that provide us with the opportunity to network and to gain access to trainings that we might not have had access to because of our geographical location. One of the standout initiatives that comes to mind is Young Mute Off Thursdays, which is the younger sister group to Mute Off Thursdays. But Young Mute Off Thursdays is targeted towards practitioners with 7 years PQE and under. And as many of the women there are in the early stages of building their professional network, it's such a friendly forum, which also serves as a platform to both build your network, but also to be a bridge between young and senior practitioners for mentorship and support. Arbitration Idol has also been a fantastic way to network with distinguished arbitration practitioners while also supporting UNICEF. Careers in Arbitration answers all questions that young practitioners would ever want to know about, as it's called, developing a career in arbitration, that was started by Amanda Lees. Podcasts and social media apps are also ubiquitous in these times, with Tales of the Tribunal releasing a weekly podcast every Thursday, which covers arbitration news, opportunities, and events for younger practitioners. Digital Coffee Break in Arbitration is another one as well, which was founded after the pandemic kicked off. And International Arbitration Juniors and Arbitration Happy Hour both still regularly continue to host sessions on Clubhouse. So if you haven't tried any one of these new initiatives yet, I would really encourage younger practitioners to at least try one of them, because it's a really fantastic way to make the most of the situation we're in and get to meet more people in our network. I'm conscious I've just rattled off a whole bunch of names. So I'm more than happy to paste them and relevant links in the Teams chat as well if anyone's interested. But I'm conscious of the time, so I'll leave it there.
Alex, that was fantastic, and I've written down that podcast, Arbitration Tales. I might subscribe to that and have a listen. Another initiative is the Rising Arbitrators Initiative, and they have regular webinars. So there are a lot of opportunities out there, and it really is time for young practitioners to shine. I don't think we've received any questions, but we do have 2 minutes if anyone still has any questions. Otherwise, I am conscious that there's another session starting at 9 a.m. Sydney time, 8 a.m. for those of us not on daylight savings, and 6 p.m. for Rika. It's been an absolutely fantastic chat. I've really enjoyed it, and what really shines to me is the sense of community in arbitration, and whether that's the entire arbitration community as a whole or all these subgroups such as REAL, Rising Arbitrators Initiative, all the other Arbitral Women, of course, which is the platform for this discussion today. Thanks very much for adding those to the chat, Alex. They all look very interesting. Not that I've used Clubhouse before. I think I might be too old for that one. But can I thank our speakers, Rika, Donna and Alex, for joining us today. And thank you also for all of you who tuned in to listen. I hope you enjoy all of the many fantastic events throughout Australian Arbitration Week. And no doubt I'll see you on another platform at some point during the week. So at this point, I will close the meeting and thank you again to everyone.